Scarborough Shoal.
Scarborough Shoal.
Scarborough Shoal.
The Philippines strongly protests the recent approval by the State Council of China of the establishment of the so-called Wangyan Island National Nature Reserve. Bajo de Masinloc is a long-standing and integral part of the Philippines, over which it has sovereignty and jurisdiction.
中方不接受菲方的无理指责和所谓的抗议，敦促菲方切实停止有关侵权挑衅和肆意炒作，避免给海上局势增添复杂因素。
When China announced plans to transform Scarborough Shoal into a marine nature reserve, it sounded almost benign, a gesture of ecological stewardship. But in Manila, alarm bells rang. For the Philippines, this wasn't environmental policy. It was déjà vu. 13 years after losing effective control of Scarborough to China, and nearly 3 decades after watching Mischief Reef morph from a humble fisherman's shelter into a full-fledged military outpost, the Philippines has made its stance crystal clear. Scarborough Shoal will not be militarized. At a press briefing with the Foreign Correspondents Association of the Philippines, Armed Forces Chief General Romeo Brawner Jr. didn't mince words. "We do not want another Mischief Reef," Brawner declared. "That's why we are closely watching their actions." His warning echoes one of the darkest chapters in modern Philippine maritime history.
I don't think they want to do something to us. Otherwise, we are well within the ring.
In 1995, China quietly erected small wooden structures on Mischief Reef, claiming they were shelters for fishermen caught in bad weather. At the time, Manila protested diplomatically but refrained from any decisive action, a restraint that Beijing later exploited. Over the next 2 decades, those modest huts evolved into sprawling military bases, complete with radar installations, surface-to-air missiles, deep harbors, and a 2,700-meter runway capable of hosting fighter jets and bombers. Brawner was alluding to this very salami slice strategy, the slow, deliberate transformation of reefs and shoals under the pretense of civilian or environmental use, only to reveal militarized fortresses a few years later. Once we monitor any construction activity, we will address it diplomatically. Quickly, Brawner emphasized. Known locally as Bajo de Masinloc, Scarborough Shoal has been part of Filipino fishing life for centuries. A natural sanctuary where generations of fishermen sought shelter and sustenance long before the modern maritime disputes began. The shoal lies just 125 nautical miles from Luzon, well within the Philippines' internationally recognized Exclusive Economic Zone, EEZ, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. By contrast, it is more than 470 nautical miles from China's Hainan Island. For decades, Scarborough was quietly shared. Filipino and even Chinese fishermen occasionally crossed paths without confrontation. But that fragile coexistence shattered in 2012, when a standoff erupted between the Philippine Navy's BRP Gregorio del Pilar and Chinese maritime surveillance ships after Filipino authorities attempted to apprehend Chinese fishing boats suspected of illegal harvesting. The standoff dragged on for weeks, ending only after a US-brokered mutual withdrawal, which China ultimately ignored. Beijing's ships stayed, effectively seizing control of the shoal and raising Chinese markers within months. Since then, China has maintained de facto control, stationing Coast Guard cutters and maritime militia vessels that routinely block or harass Filipino fishermen, often within sight of Philippine waters.
On whether there can be joint development with China on our exclusive economic zone, my opinion is it's not possible because under the Constitution, there's a provision there which says that the use and enjoyment of the exclusive economic zone shall be reserved exclusively to Filipinos.
In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague ruled unequivocally in Manila's favor, invalidating Beijing's sweeping 9-dash line claims, and affirming the Philippines' sovereign rights within its EEZ. But Beijing simply ignored the ruling, tightening its grip on Scarborough and surrounding waters, a defiance that continues to define the regional power imbalance to this day. China's September 10 declaration of a so-called marine nature reserve at Scarborough Shoal immediately raised suspicion across the region. For many in Manila, it sounded eerily familiar. The same playbook Beijing had used in the mid-1990s and again in the 2010s, when seemingly harmless projects turned into fortified military outposts. Analysts quickly pointed to that pattern of soft rhetoric masking strategic intent. What begins as a claim of environmental protection or humanitarian purpose often ends with radar towers, runways, and missile batteries, all under the banner of sovereignty. Manila's Department of Foreign Affairs wasted no time issuing a strong and unequivocal diplomatic protest, calling Beijing's move both illegal and deceptive. Philippine officials recalled how Mischief Reef was first justified as a fisherman's shelter in 1995. Only to become a sprawling military base 2 decades later, and how Subi and Fiery Cross Reefs followed the same trajectory in the 2010s, culminating in China's Great Wall of Sand. The Philippines suspects that the nature reserve announcement may serve as a legal facade for gradual militarization, giving Beijing a diplomatic shield while laying groundwork for future installations. Beijing, however, stated that it was acting within its sovereign rights to protect the shoal's ecological diversity, insisting that its environmental efforts were peaceful. But for Manila and much of the world, those words sound less like conservation and more like camouflage for control. Manila's fears were vindicated just weeks later. On October 1, the People's Liberation Army, PLA, Southern Theater Command, released footage of combat readiness drills over Scarborough, featuring H-6 bombers armed with YJ-12 supersonic anti-ship missiles, escorted by J-16 fighter jets and Type 054A frigates. The display wasn't subtle. The YJ-12, capable of striking targets up to 500 kilometers away, can threaten virtually any vessel operating near Luzon or the Philippine Sea. These drills followed months of Chinese patrols and encounters, including dangerous interceptions of Philippine reconnaissance flights and aggressive maneuvers against Coast Guard vessels escorting local fishing boats under Manila's Kadiwa program. Brawner's tone was resolute. Once they build a structure there, that would be a different story. The Philippine military, he said, is preparing to expand its joint exercises, not just with the United States, but with other like-minded partners such as Japan and Australia, to reinforce deterrence and readiness in the West Philippine Sea. The stakes are immense. Scarborough Shoal sits near vital sea lanes that link the South China Sea to the Philippine mainland. A Chinese military outpost there would extend Beijing's surveillance and missile reach deep into Philippine territory, effectively closing a choke point between Luzon and the open Pacific. The warning over Scarborough comes amid a larger transformation of the Philippines' defense posture. From Palawan's Oyster Bay, where the U.S. recently funded base upgrades, to Batanes in the north, where troops overlook the Bashi Channel near Taiwan, Manila is reinforcing its perimeter, quietly but steadily. Scarborough, however, remains the most emotional and symbolic battleground. It's not just about strategy, it's about sovereignty, livelihood, and national pride. Every Filipino fisherman barred from his traditional waters, every Coast Guard vessel rammed or blocked, fuels a deeper question. How long can Beijing claim peaceful intentions while flexing missile bombers over Philippine seas? For the Philippines, Scarborough is no longer just a coral reef. It's a test of resolve. Brawner's message, stripped of diplomatic niceties, carries historical weight. We allowed them before. We will not allow them again. In the shadow of history's warnings, from Mischief Reef to the artificial islands of the Spratlys, Manila seems determined to draw a line. Whether that line holds will define not just the Philippines' future in the South China Sea, but the credibility of international law itself.